Hey guys, Darion Peta from the Geopolitica Mundial channel here, and in today's video we're going to get straight to the point. Let me ask you, do you think the world is better or worse compared to the past? And I'm sure that most of you are going to say that it's worse. And I'll agree with you if you tell me that it's worse compared to 10, 20, 30, maybe 40, at most 50 years ago. But more than that, I'll disagree, and I'll prove empirically in today's video that yes, humanity is better. Before we begin, remember to subscribe and share this video with everyone you know. Because if you share, you make sure that Geopolitica Mundial keeps growing and existing, because if it depends on YouTube, it will keep pushing Geopolitica Mundial into the dark corners of the internet. So your support is very important. I'm Darion Peta, and this is the Geopolitica Mundial channel. A moral idea, if not accompanied by the means to implement it, becomes an unattainable utopia. But a high technological standard, without a morality to regulate it, becomes a hellish dystopia. Historically, the balance between the two things has been fundamental for the development of society. It's no use for a philosophy or an ideology, whatever it may be, to preach an ideal world that can't be implemented without causing economic suffering to the population. That's why embracing an idea that isn't realistic will inevitably result in suffering and setbacks. And all the gains achieved up to that point end up being lost because of this good idea. After all, remember the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. On the other hand, when new technologies and knowledge emerge far ahead of the ethical and moral standards of a society, what we have often seen is carnage, totalitarianism, and genocide. This ends up wearing down that population and leading to the collapse of that very empire, country, or nation. Morality does not exist in a vacuum. It is always conditioned by the material capacity of a society to carry out what it considers morally desirable. When a moral norm demands behaviors that the technological base cannot sustain, that norm is not practical morality. It's abstract idealism, an ideal world that cannot be reached and therefore becomes something empty. It doesn't guide action, it only projects desires, which, if forced down people's throats, end up causing more harm than good. Slavery is a perfect example of this, because it was already morally criticized by many philosophers and priests many centuries before the modern age. In antiquity, in the Middle Ages, slavery was not an isolated moral deviation, but a structural component of the available economic system. It was directly linked to agricultural productivity, urban logistics, infrastructure construction, and even the maintenance of armies that depended on human labor to keep functioning. It was a basic institution of the economy. Fighting it meant disrupting the functioning of that civilization, whether in Europe, Africa, the Middle East, Asia, or even in the Americas. That's why speeches condemning slavery were not taken very seriously, because it was simply something impractical. The cost of a transition was too high for the system to bear without collapsing. Before machines, before fossil fuels, before automation, the alternative to slavery was not free and dignified labor, but a productive collapse. Defending the end of slavery in that context was not a practical moral stance. It was a denial of the material conditions of that civilization as it existed. Morality only becomes operational and applicable on a full scale when technology creates room for it. The end of slavery only becomes structurally possible when non-human energy sources begin to emerge, such as coal, steam, electricity, and engines, which would replace forced labor on a large scale. From that point on, abolitionist morality would cease to be utopian and would become a real political choice. What was once just rhetoric then became applicable and therefore was now realistic, and the opposite is also true. Technology without a moral framework is not progress. It's an amplification of raw power. Every innovation increases human capacity for action, but it doesn't define its direction. Without ethical limits, technology tends to maximize efficiency, control, and domination, because those are the natural tendencies of competitive systems. The result is not neutrality, but a dystopia, with societies that are highly efficient at producing suffering, surveillance, and power asymmetry. As always, those who read Karl Marx become socialists, but those who read Marx and understand him become capitalists. That's because he says in the preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy that social and legal relations are conditioned by the material mode of production. Morality cannot be imposed against the productive base. For him, slavery was not a moral mistake, but a production relation compatible with a certain technological level. Abolitionist morality only becomes historical when productivity makes free labor more efficient than forced labor. Wage labor, as we know it today, does not arise because it is more moral, but because it is more productive, flexible, and compatible with capital accumulation. Max Weber, however, takes a different approach. In the book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, he shows that moral values only become dominant when they are functionally compatible with the economic and technical organization of that society. There is a passage in his book that I really like, where he explains that for the Puritan mindset, God is guided primarily by moral criteria, and secondly, by the importance that the goods to be produced have for the community. That's why when ethics come into direct conflict with material efficiency, they end up becoming marginal or are eventually abandoned. Therefore, for him, morality needs to work in the real world. So, in a way, we could understand that in this sense, he meant that the morality that prevails is the one that adapts to material efficiency. If you follow the channel, you probably saw my video on the 4 technological singularities. If not, I'll link it in the description and recommend watching it later. Because one thing that is directly connected to the concept of technological singularities is the new perceptions of reality that each of them brings. You see, technological singularities are key or bottleneck technologies, depending on your point of view, that change everything. And I mean literally everything. That's why they are rare, and we've only seen 4 of them so far since the beginning of humanity. One of the things they cause is a change in how human beings interpret reality and interact with the universe. In other words, imagine that we've opened Pandora's box. We can't close it anymore, and even if we try, it doesn't help because what came out of it is already out. But instead of just one Pandora's box, we have 4. Now, what was inside each one is out. The way we see and understand everything around us, reality itself, has also changed because of this. So now we understand everything in a more detailed and comprehensive way. This changes how we interact with nature, with the universe, with ourselves, and with others. It also involves morality. There are 2 scientists I recommend who talk about something along these lines, the historian Louis Manford and Hans Jonas. Lewis says in Technics and Civilization and in The Myth of the Machine that every technology creates a possible moral field. Certain ethics are unfeasible without specific technologies, and certain technologies inevitably put pressure on existing morality. That's why, when technology advances faster than ethics, what he calls the mega machine emerges, a system that is technically efficient but morally corrupt. In these cases, these machines treat humans as mere components. He explains that excessive attention to accounting and standardization, as well as the elevation of military leaders to divine status, are characteristics of these mega machines. Like the repetitive nature of Egyptian paintings that depicted the pharaohs as gods, as well as the display of enlarged portraits of communist leaders such as Mao Zedong and Stalin. Similar to Hans Jonas, who states that modern technological power creates actions whose moral consequences did not exist before, and therefore there is a new ethic. Old morality, if applied to new technology, leads to irresponsibility. New technology without new ethics leads to catastrophe. So, ethics needs quote-unquote to catch up with the reach of technical power. And what I mean by all this is that the world doesn't seem worse because we are morally regressing, as many traditionalists or people nostalgic for a time that never existed, who romanticize the past, say. But the world seems worse because we have become morally unable to tolerate things that used to be normal. Often, some traditionalist says, abandon modernity and embrace tradition. However, this won't be possible in the vast majority of cases. New technologies will bring points of no return, and that's why there's no going back. What we can do is try to guide the new based on the past. Notice that, throughout almost all of human history, domestic violence was considered normal, slavery was normal, child labor was normal, sexual assaults as rewards in war were also considered normal, mass death was also seen as normal, and depending on the context, even considered ethically justifiable. What changed was not the existence of evil itself, it was the threshold of moral intolerance that we have today. Today, an isolated case becomes a global scandal precisely because it is an isolated case, and as it grows, more social outrage is generated. Of course, we have to avoid the trap of judging the past with today's moralistic eyes. After all, the interpretation of reality was different back then, precisely because knowledge of the environment was more limited and mainly technological means, and knowledge imposed certain limits on the morality of that time. No society making moral progress feels comfortable. Moral comfort is a sign of stagnation, not advancement. Notice that, for centuries, information about what was happening was limited to a few people who could read and write. Today, the global average of people who can read and write after the age of 15 is 87%, but just 70 years ago. In the 1950s, it was only 50 to 56%. And before 1900, only about 10% of the world's population could read. So, reading and the spread of information were concentrated in the hands of a very, very small minority. In the 20th century, the rise of radio and television expanded access to information. But even so, the spread of information was limited to a few station owners who, by the way, were connected to the government, so they controlled what was convenient for them to broadcast. But, starting in the 2000s, the internet, in just 25 years, turned information into something like a blockchain, taking control and the monopoly of information away from the big broadcasters who were tied to the governments. And even though the owners of big tech try to control what is posted, as they have been doing, you can see that they have even lost the ability to do that. Because the fact is that this spread of information sources is another point of no return, which even they can't control. At most, they can dilute it for a while. Of course, there is still manipulation of information. In fact, it exists today on an even larger scale than in the past, but it's not like it was before, precisely because now there are many more sources of this information. So, we have much more information warfare than at any other time. And this impacts the morality of societies all over the world. Technology has amplified information, exposed abuses, given a voice to more people, and connected realities that were previously invisible. The result was more moral shock per unit of time, a sense of ethical collapse, and a perception of excessive conflict. But this is not decadence. It's exhaustion, it's fatigue, it's the temporal compression of moral progress. And one important thing you have to understand is that a society can only discuss morality when it has at least solved the basics of survival. Even though there is still poverty in the world today, it is nothing compared to what existed 50 years ago, and even less compared to what existed in previous centuries. So, there was an increase in wealth creation, which of course was not distributed equally around the world or even within nations, but it's undeniable that this happened. This left most people with time to focus on what is or isn't moral and ethical, because they no longer need to worry 24 hours a day, 7 days a week about water, food, and energy. This, of course, can also have a negative effect, leading to the excessive moralism we see today, where people become overly moralistic, annoying, getting offended by anything, and everything becomes boring because anything can be offensive. But it's also a radical reaction that tends to diminish over the decades. Notice that we are reaching levels of productivity without historical precedent, where people will have to police themselves over what they produce, because this productive surplus can end up being destructive. The so-called deepfakes, which put anyone's face into any scene, are becoming increasingly realistic, and soon it will be impossible to distinguish the fake from reality. So, how can you judge a person in an erotic, depraved, or humiliating situation if it could be fake, and anyone, including yourself, could be the target tomorrow? Or take 3D printing technologies where anyone could print weapons at home. It's a point of no return. There's no use regulating it. There's no use in lawmakers shouting, judges and prosecutors signing orders, or the police trying to stop this from happening, because again, society is already operating in a way that's almost similar to blockchains. Attempts to regulate this will have a short lifespan, just a few years. The authorities who try to impose themselves on this will be fighting against a force of nature, and they will eventually be humbled by this superior force and will see their power amount to nothing. because this knowledge, combined with this technology, will be spread among many people all over the globe, so it will be beyond the control of these authorities. There is no doubt that the government's ability to deal with this, even if they force regulations, will fail. It will lead to a chaotic period that will force the population to self-regulate morally, because they will be more aware of the consequences of their actions, and not necessarily because something is against the law. I'm not saying it will be a perfect world, but that the current conflict is the price of progress, and it tends to eventually stabilize. And until this voluntary stabilization comes, make no mistake, there will be a lot of blood and suffering. We are being pushed into an era where ethics will no longer be imposed by the fear of state punishment, but by the need for coexistence. If anyone can cause immense harm, trust and reputation will become the most valuable currencies, even more than they are today. Of course, there is room for optimism, not because technology is inherently good, but because humanity has proven to be adaptable. And we have reached this level of technological power, carrying millennia-old baggage of philosophy, religion, and morality. Maybe the initial chaos is just a growing pain that's necessary for us to stop being supervised by the state and for us to become morally more consistent. What I mean is that out of all the historical moments when such a disruptive technology could have arrived, at least it has arrived now. In the least bad of times, where we have some chance to at least balance ourselves. And well folks, in the face of so much bad news, murders, robberies, kidnappings, organized crime and drug trafficking that just keeps growing, I understand that it really gives the feeling that we're witnessing the moral decay of society. But again, it's that question. Compared to which period? It's like we take 2 steps forward, and every now and then take 1 step back, and right now we've taken a step back. But you'll remember that scene from The Matrix, when they pull Neo out from among the machines, put him in the goo, he opens his eyes are burning, and he complains. And Morpheus turns to him and says, "Yes, your eyes are burning because it's the first time you're using them." Why are my eyes hurting? Because you've never used them before. That's what's happening. For the first time, you're using your eyes and ears. And you're confused. You see so much information coming at you that it's making you tired, it's outraging you. But this exhaustion, this fatigue, it's cognitive, not moral. The fact that you get upset with these corrupt authorities who use your hard-earned money, taking it through increasingly abusive taxes, and if you don't pay, you go to jail, and they use that money to protect the very criminals. That outrage of yours, that anger, that fury, is the sign of a better morality. You can't go along with these unjust things. So if you're outraged, yes, you are part of a more moral society. And of course, information comes to light more, let's say, openly than in the past, so it gets tiring. It's a transition phase that we're witnessing. And we have to move toward a more moral society, because in the face of new disruptive technologies, there is no alternative. It's not that I'm optimistic that the world will get better. It's just that if society doesn't become more moral, faced with these increasingly destructive technologies, the only option besides improvement is the extinction of the human species itself. So it's not that I believe or am hoping things will get better. It's that there is no alternative. Either we improve in the coming decades, or these new technologies will wipe out humanity. It's that simple. It's all or nothing. So, everyone, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it. Share this video with everyone you know to help the channel keep growing. But if you really like the Geopolitica Mundial channel, consider becoming a member. By becoming a member, you help support the channel and get early video access plus exclusive live streams. You can interact with me directly, and you'll also get access to the Telegram groups, where I'm often active as well. And on top of that, depending on your membership level, your name will appear here at the end as a thank you in the credits list. Alright, so guys, thank you very much. Hugs. And see you in the next video.